Hey, this is Dave Braz from Bear Hill Baits. I'm coming to you with my first video of what will be a series of videos talking about some of the baits that I'm making, along with some of the baits out there in the market that I have a lot of confidence in, along with some techniques that I'd like to share with you to hopefully make you a better angler. But today I'm super proud to introduce this little bait that I've created here. I don't have a lot of clout with some of the bait manufacturers or some of the mold manufacturers, but when it came to making this bait, I got to select the different components that put this bait together. And I'm super excited to present this because it's a technique that I think that people use quite a bit, and I think it's a bait that people use quite a bit, but don't think that people put it together very often. And I'm talking about flipping a tube. Um, a lot of people talk about the positives of a tube, right? And let me just say right off the bat, this is not your grandfather's tube. This is not that kind of bait that you could rig 1,000 ways and present it 1,000 ways, and it can mimic anything you want. For the most part, this tube is specifically designed for flipping. And I'll walk you through some of the components on why a tube makes a great flipping bait, and then what makes this tube in particular very, very special. First off, flipping a tube. If you see what a tube looks like, very, very streamlined profile. Not a lot of appendages, not a lot of arms flailing, flapping, ribbon tails. When this thing falls, it falls pretty straight down. You'll see that it often will kind of spiral down a little bit. But for the most part, what's great about it is if you are flipping it into vegetation, a laydown, brush piles, whatever the case may be, when it gets into the thick stuff, it really just does a great job of finding its way getting down to the bottom. And you'll see that it does a great job of doing that. It's not a whole lot of stuff going on with this. Very, very subtle profile. But it also meets the profile a lot of bait fish that may be also living in those brush piles. About this bait, the first thing that people are going to notice is the ribs. The ribs do a number of different things, and a lot of flipping baits now are coming with the ribs, and they do a few different things for you. The first thing that people notice is when you touch it, it's got a real different texture to it, right? And I don't know how much that makes a difference, but I can say right off the bat that when you get it in your fingers, the first thing you're going to say is, hey, that's a lot different than some of the more traditional baits with flat sides that I'm accustomed to. And you'd have to wonder whether or not the texture makes a little bit of a difference when it actually gets in the fish's mouth. But it does do a couple of other things too. And one thing it does do is these ribs actually trap air. So when you flip this bait out, when it goes down, it actually is pulling some air with it and releasing as it goes down, and it'll leave a trail of bubbles behind it. And typically when it hits bottom, that's where it'll actually start bubbling up even more. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's a very, very subtle approach in just attracting a little more attention to itself. The other thing that these ribs will do is, and people who throw D-bombs will be able to attest to this, is if you like to add scent to a bait, these ribs hold scent really well. So, if you put a little bit of scent on a flat-sided bait and throw it out there, for the most part, that stuff's gone within a couple of casts. With the ribbed baits, you're going to see that scent holds quite a bit longer. The other thing it's going to do is in trying to Texas rig this bait, you're going to be able to utilize the ribs to bury the point of the hook back into the ribs. And what that's going to do is rather than that hook really punching through a whole lot of plastic, it's just got a couple of little pieces of plastic from the ribs covering the point of that hook, but still keeps it super, super weedless. And once again, we're going to be throwing this thing into some really, really crazy places, but I want to walk through how I rig this particular bait because, I think that this is something that's a little bit different because it's got such a wide profile to it. This isn't like flipping a rage craw. I mean, you see how thick this bait is, and that's quite a bit of plastic. Even the people who like to flip tubes, there's some drawbacks to flipping tubes, particularly the ones that aren't really meant for flipping. And the first thing is at the top of these baits, typically, they're made with a very thin plastic at the head. And the point is that you're supposed to be able to stick a jig tube head in there, and that's kind of leaving it kind of vulnerable, because when you actually go ahead and put a Texas rig hook through the top of the bait, the eye of that hook is kind of going in and going out. You catch a fish, you get snagged, it slides down the shaft of the hook, and the eye of that hook tears a little hole. Then the line kind of slices the hole open a little more. Next thing you know, you're ripping through tubes like crazy. Um, what's special about this tube in particular is you'll see there's actually a lot of meat to the head of that tube. There's over 1/2 inch of plastic here at the top of the tube. Now this tube is made to be very buoyant, but I also left enough of a cavity that if you feel the need to make it even more buoyant, you can take like a foam earplug and stuff it on the inside of this and get a little more buoyancy out of it. But this tube is made with very, very high quality plastic that is very buoyant. It's very buoyant unless I do something to make it more dense and weight it down, to which on this particular bait I did nothing to weight it down. I want it to be completely buoyant. When this thing hits bottom, I want it to stand straight up. But when rigging this bait, I like to go ahead and Texas rig this bait typically with an EWG worm hook. And I know that there are a lot of people out there, and there are actually some straight shank wide gap flipping hooks made for a tube. I haven't gotten into those yet. This is basically how I was taught how to throw this bait, and I got to be honest with you, I've had a lot of confidence in it. I'm not really missing fish, so I don't really want to change a whole lot. But when you say that you're flipping an EWG style hook, the first thing people will say, and a lot of pros will say, is you do not want to flip this hook. And the reason for that is if you look at these hooks, you see the point is right in line with the eye. And the thing is that means that this hook is not meant to be pulled directly straight. There's just no bite to that hook if you were to pull it straight. There are some people who say, well, bend it out or bend it sideways. I really feel like bending hooks really messes with the integrity of the hook, so I don't necessarily like to bend it if I can avoid it. But these hooks are really designed for Carolina rigging a bait, throwing a zoom fluke. Baits where a fish will typically come up, grab it, and turn away. And what ends up happening is that when you set the hook on a fish that's turning away, you're not pulling the hook straight out of their mouth. It's coming out at an angle. Well, when you're flipping, a lot of times you flip a bait in, it falls past the fish's mouth, they suck it in, and then they sit there. They don't move sometimes. And what ends up happening is you go to set and you're pulling that hook straight out. And a hook like this, without a lot of bite, you're probably going to miss some fish. Little tip that was shown to me is to actually snell this hook. Now, when you're snelling, let's say, a straight shank flipping hook, you get a real 90-degree turn. That thing just completely pops up. With this, it's going to be a little more subtle. Okay? And you'll see how that thing just pops up just like that. What that does is it makes sure that that hook does not come straight out. And what you're saying is a lot of times it'll actually go ahead and do it on the side. I have this rigged on braid right now, but I would traditionally do it on fluorocarbon. But you'll see how it definitely just pops up. So the question might be, well, why don't you use a straight shank flipping hook? Well, the answer comes back to the bait itself. This being such a wide profile bait, in a lot of cases you're putting that straight shank flipping hook, and when that fish bites into it and you set into them, on the keel of the hook, or on the bend of the hook, is going to be the plastic of the bait plus the fish's mouth. And I just look at some of the straight shank flipping hooks out there and just say, I don't know if I want all of that bunched up on that hook. I probably would rather it be on a wide gap hook where I'd have more room. I've tried straight shank flipping hooks on this method. I did not get a whole lot of success. This has been kind of a money maker for me. And just I've rigged this up with either a 3/8 to a 1/2 ounce. I don't go much more than a 1/2 ounce. But you're more than welcome to go ahead and give it a try if you want to throw this into some heavier vegetation or throw it into deeper water. The other thing I do like to do is I do include a bobber stop. And I will slide that bobber stop down and I will peg that weight. The godfathers of flipping, the Gary Kleins, the Denny Browers, the Ishman Rose, all kind of come from the school of thought where they say, never peg a weight unless you have to. And the reason you would ever have to peg a weight is typically that you're throwing in vegetation that's thick, and you're afraid that your weight will make it through, but your bait will still be staying up top. So you'd actually go ahead and peg that to make sure that the bait and the weight stay together when they're on the fall. I agree with that. However, once again, this is meant for thick vegetation. So my thought process is don't ever peg a weight if you don't have to, but then I say don't ever throw this tube unless you have to peg your weight. This is meant for thick vegetation, laydowns around grass, milfoil, brush piles, whatever you think that you could get this into. One thing this also does is this bait skips really, really well. So you can definitely throw it under docks and try to get it into, particularly for the people who love to throw their Christmas trees under docks. If you can find those people who do that and you skip this guy under it, it's going to skip really well and get through that tree really well. That little brush pile that they have going underneath their dock, are really just a true winner. The next thing I want to talk about is about some of the modifications I would make to this bait, along with when and how I would throw it. This particular bait could mimic a number of different things. To me, the best thing that it mimics is actually a bait fish. To me, I think the most success that I've had around this bait is typically after the bluegill spawn. So for us, you're probably talking the June, July area where this has become an absolute money bait. What ends up happening, a lot of the thicker, dense vegetated ponds and lakes is those juvenile bluegill start to come out of the shallows a little bit and start really congregating in some of the vegetation there. And throwing one of these to mimic a bluegill is absolutely money. So you see the color that I have here. This is green pumpkin, purple flake on one side, and blue on the other. A modification that I would potentially make to this bait, number one, is I do leave the skirt very long. That's intentional. If you feel like it's getting you hung up or it's not getting to what you need it to be, you can most certainly trim that down a little bit. It'll make the bait have a smaller profile. It'll be a little more streamlined. It'll be more weight and less bait. It'll probably get down there a little bit faster. You'll increase the rate of fall. But the other thing I do like to do, spike it. Now people tend to go crazy with dyes. Once they they started a little bit and they did it a little and it worked for them. So next thing you know, they're dipping their whole baits in dyes. This is something that we're working on a very subtle approach here, but we're talking about just adding a little bit of flair to this thing. Now with the green pumpkin blue laminate, I would probably go with a chartreuse rather than a red. But one thing that I really like to do is I like to take this bait, I like to tip it upside down, and I like to color the inside of the skirt. And then, when you're throwing it, normally you can barely tell that it's spiked. But what ends up happening is when that tube hits bottom, that skirt will flare open and flash a little bit of that chartreuse on the inside. And June, July, the bluegill around here, for the most part, really get a lot of sun to them. Their tails and their fins become very, very light colored. They have like this chartreusey blue look to them. And to me, there is no better way to mimic one of them than with this. This green pumpkin blue, throw a little chartreuse on the end, and I think you absolutely have just a spot-on mimic of a baby bluegill. And you just see that. I don't think that's something that you can beat right there. You can mimic craw. depending on what type of lake it is and what the fish are feeding on, right? I look at that type of year and some of the ponds that I fish, and I say, that time of year they're crushing bluegill. I want to go with this type of color. You can always go with the black. Black is a very popular color as well, but for the most part, I mean, it's not quite a year-round bait, I don't think. I would say anytime that you're flipping is a year-round technique, but a lot of times when you get into the really, really cold winter months, a lot of vegetation tends to die off, and I don't know if you need to be throwing tubes into that type of thing or some of the extremely weedless. However, the one thing it will do is it does present the subtle approach that you do need in cold water. So, kind of balance that out and take that with a grain of salt. Talk about the setup here and how I would use this. I have this rigged. This is braid, and it was just so you guys can see this a little bit better. I would throw this on fluorocarbon. And one of the things I really, like we talked about where we're going to throw this bait, we're going to be throwing this bait in vegetation and around wood. I am very much against throwing braid around wood, particularly wood that's submerged underwater. So if you take like a lay down, for example, a tree fallen in the water, the wood is soaking in the water, it's going to start to rot, it's going to get very soft. And, the braid this is Power Pro Spectra here, super coarse. And, you pitch this thing in there, and a fish pulls, and then you pull, and the fish pulls, and you pull, and this thing just saws right into soft wood. So I tend to really try to avoid braid around wood. Now, here's the thing is that when I'm going out there, I'm typically throwing into all of it. And granted, the braid would work a lot better in the vegetation, because the braid cuts right through vegetation, but the fluorocarbon, I feel like, just actually deals with both just a little bit. It's not as good in the vegetation, but it's much better in the wood, but it can do both. What I have here is rigged up is 20-pound test fluorocarbon. That's typically my go-to when I'm flipping this style of bait. You could go to 25 if you'd like. If you're going any less, you kind of run into some issues. I typically don't like flipping with fluorocarbon less than 20 pounds, mostly because, when dealing with the line, I tend to think that the thicker the line, the easier it is to manage. But in this one here, this is Seaguar 20-pound Abrazex. Once again, abrasion-resistant line, very good around wood, very good around rocks. Don't forget, just because you're using 20-pound test line or you're using 65-pound test braid, that you think that you don't have to retie. Remember, always retie. Always be sliding your fingers up and down that line to kind of feel if there's any fray. Particularly when you're dealing with, these tungsten weights. A lot of them today have inserts now to try to stop it from rubbing and stop it from, fraying your line. However, you still got to check. In a lot of cases, what ends up happening is a fish grabs, or you catch a fish, and during the fight, the bobber stop slides up the line, the weight getting shifted back and forth, back and forth. That's a lot of rubbing, and even for an abrasion-resistant line, always double check that line. For a reel, I have here Abu Garcia STX 7:1:1. For me, I think this is the ideal speed, the ideal gear ratio for a reel for flipping. You definitely want something with some speed to it. When you're flipping into someplace or around anything, about 75% of your strikes are going to come on the initial fall. And when you hop that bait once, twice, a good portion of your strikes are going to come on the fall after that. And then the rest will typically come when you're trying to get that bait out of there and get ready for your next cast. So you definitely want a reel with some speed to it that can go ahead and pick up slack really quickly. However, I would stay away from the Revo Rockets or any of the reels that have a 8 or 9:1 gear ratio type style, because basically you're looking at a reel that's all speed and no torque. Don't forget, we're going to be throwing this thing around some heavy vegetation. We're going to be throwing this thing around some brush piles. You're definitely going to want some torque to muscle the fish out of there. So definitely you want something with some speed, but you can't go max speed and have no torque behind it. The rod, this is a 7.6 Abu Garcia Ike series rod. I've really grown to come to like these rods for a number of different reasons. Is they've really tailored these rods for specific purposes. And even though this one in particular isn't exactly tailored for this application, I actually really like it for this application. But what they've actually done was, and I think that this actually makes things very simple for everybody. I grew up throwing the Veritas rods for a long time, and I switched to St. Croix for a little while. I dabbled with Dobbin. I've dabbled with G Loomis a little bit, but I ended up coming back to this just because for the price, it's a very, very good rod. Anybody who's thrown a Veritas is probably very familiar with something very similar to this, but then how they design these rods is a little different than I think with the Veritas, and how they created these rods and kind of how they mark these rods is a little different. It's so hard when you're like switching between the different rod brands and the different manufacturers, because there's so many of them, and especially because when they say medium or medium heavy, it's all relative. A medium to one company is not a medium to another, so you kind of look at that and say, I'm not really sure what this. You actually have to go to the store, put it in your hands, and feel it out. But I think the Ike series, they've really started something, and I've seen it catch on quite a bit. And you're starting to see companies start to refer to rods rather than medium heavy, whatever the case may be. They start referring to them in percentages, and it's the percentage of backbone, it's the percentage of tip, right? This particular rod, they're calling it an 80-20, which is 80% backbone, 20% tip. And you'll see that the tip's got it's got a nice little flexion to it, which is, I think, perfect for flipping, right? I think that we're starting to see now that the softer tips are really compensating for a lot of mistakes. It's really we've come a long way when it comes to flipping. I mean, you got to think of the old days when you're talking about the Denny Brauers and the Gary Kleins. All they had was mono, and mono stretches a ton. So their rods that they used back in the day used to be just broomsticks. And we're talking pool cues with no flex whatsoever. But they had so much stretch in the line that was okay. You know, introducing braid to the mix, braid has no stretch whatsoever. So all of a sudden you start spooling up one of these pool cues with braid, and now you have a rod with no flex, you have a line with no stretch, and you're pitching. So you're making short casts. And you know, I'm sure we've all done it at one point in time, but you go and jack a little fish and you catapult him over the boat. But if you go ahead and jack a bigger fish, you're going to rip his lips off with that kind of setup, right? So you're starting to see more and more rods with softer tips, and it's because the lines that we're using nowadays are becoming less and less flexible. Not to mention the hooks today, right? Back in the day, everybody used to have a file in their tackle box because hooks just weren't that sharp, and they didn't stay that sharp either. Today, now you're looking at the Trokars and you're looking at the Gamakatsus and a number of other different companies out there, and these things are super sharp. And to be quite honest with you, you don't need to put a whole lot of stress on these hooks to punch it through a fish's mouth. So definitely, you're starting to look at that softer tip, and then when it's fighting the fish, it's letting them move around a little bit, but constantly keeping tension, but not too much tension. Too much tension, what will end up happening is it'll actually start wearing a hole in them, to which they actually can get off. So you're looking at a real good setup here. I think we're going in the right direction in terms of rods. This one's a really good one. There are a ton of other good ones out there, but go with what works for you. Go with what gives you confidence. The confidence is probably the biggest key more than anything else. Because you got to look. People are different sizes. We're all using different baits, all different lines, and it's kind of just even how you set the hook and how much strength you put behind it. You got to go with what works for you, because what works for you may not work for the guy next to you. But that's all I got for right now. I'm going to go ahead and share this. Please share, like, comment. Keep the discussion going down below. Once again, this is what works for me. That may not be what works for you, but if you've never tried this before, if you've never flipped a tube before, check out this particular bait from Bear Hill Baits. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. This is a technique that has now become, when I was growing up, I never threw tubes, and then I kind of scoffed at tubes, as I got older, and then all of a sudden I was introduced to this, and this completely changed my view on tubes. And now all of a sudden, there's been a couple of times the past couple of years where the bite was super, super tough. I couldn't even buy a bite. And all of a sudden I go, let me just start flipping a tube just to see what happens. And I start, it saved a couple of days. And I hope it can do the same for you. Check it out, Bear Hill Baits. This is the flipping tube. Check me out on Facebook. Check it out on Instagram. Share, like, keep the discussion going on below. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it.